Over James A. Baker III's political career, he served as Secretary of State, White House Chief of Staff, and an advisor to every Republican president from Gerald Ford to George W. Bush. Veteran political journalists Peter Baker and Susan Glasser examine James Baker's life, career, and legacy in The Man Who Ran Washington, a best book of the year for the New York Times and the Washington Post. The Man Who Ran Washington is a sweeping history of American political power in the late 20th century, as well as an intimate biography of an extraordinary individual. Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Susan Glasser is a staff writer for The New Yorker. For today's conversation, Baker and Glasser are joined by Senator John C. Danforth. Senator Danforth worked with James Baker during his 3 terms as U.S. Senator from Missouri and as the United States Ambassador to the United Nations.
Hi, I'm Jack Danforth, and it's my privilege to have the opportunity to interview Susan Glasser and Peter Baker about a wonderful book they wrote called The Man Who Ran Washington. It's a biography of Jim Baker, who served in many capacities in the federal government and who did, in fact, run Washington for a very long period of time. Give us some idea of what it took to write this book. What was it's not something that just flowed off the pen, that's for sure. It was a considerable effort. And what was the effort? What did you do to put this book together?
As you can see, one of the challenges is, we are married. And so getting to write a book and remain on speaking terms with your spouse, we feel like that was part of the accomplishment. But the good news is we're still talking to each other and actually doing another book. But sir, it's a great honor to be with you. I have to say, it's a little intimidating for us, when the interviewer knows more about the subject than the authors. It can be daunting indeed. But we did spend, I think it was something like close to 7 years in the end, and we had enormous cooperation from Secretary Baker, from his family, his friends. Really valuable for us was also the access to his archives at both Princeton and Rice University in Houston, where the Baker Institute is located. But, really the truth is that Peter did all the hard work, and, so blame him if you liked it or not.
Well, I liked it a lot. I thought it was just terrific.
He gets the credit.
It has, it's very well written. It is obviously very well researched. There are facts in it, and some that I know about that I had thought were pretty darn obscure. There they are, and they're important to tell the story. So how you got all that, I don't know, but it obviously took a lot of work. And both of you have day jobs. Peter with the New York Times and Susan with the New Yorker. And so with your day jobs and taking on a 7-year project, how did you happen to pick Jim Baker as the subject? Why get into Jim Baker instead of anybody else you could think of?
Right. Well, one of the things that we just were surprised to learn was that there hadn't been a biography of Jim Baker, which was remarkable, given that he was Secretary of State when the world changed, when the Cold War ended, when the Soviet Union collapsed, when Germany was reunified. So many important things happened during those 3.5 years he was at the State Department. But if that were all it were, that might not be enough. Maybe that wouldn't, but he ran 5 presidential campaigns on top of that. He was Reagan's White House Chief of Staff and helped make Reagan a success, Treasury Secretary. He had so many major roles during his time in Washington. And in some ways, he had his finger in almost every big story that happened from the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War. So we thought that his story was a great way of telling Washington's story in some ways, the larger story of a generation of big events.
Right, but it's more than an accounting of facts, and the facts are very interesting, but it really portrays a person and a style of, you said the man who ran Washington, well, how he ran Washington and his method of doing that. How would you summarize that?
Well, it was his cousin who actually came up with probably the most, kind of famous shorthand for the Jim Baker method. And his cousin called him the Velvet Hammer, which then became the Time magazine headline on a cover story about Jim Baker. It's a pretty good summation. This was a guy who we found was actually a natural negotiator at a time when negotiating was still not only possible in Washington, but in some ways was the currency of the realm, right? It wasn't that the 1980s and 1990s were some like halcyon period. You know that better than we do. It certainly was a partisan time, but at the same time, because it was divided government and it was still in the context of this Cold War confrontation, it wasn't like the kind of toxic partisan moment of today in the sense that you actually were perceived to gain politically by making deals. And that was Jim Baker's, I think, great strong suit. He had the ability to be a fierce partisan, but also to understand what the person on the other side of the table needed in order to walk away with a win as well. And, he was somebody who could, pick your pocket, but still end up somehow on speaking terms with you, which is an art that can carry you far in many professions, not just politics.
The subtitle of the book is The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. And you've kind of indicated this, but do you think that he was uniquely a product of his time and that it just wouldn't work anymore? It just, the time of Jim Baker is now behind us. He was great for 30 or 40 years ago, but right now it's something that's time has passed.
Well, it is interesting. One of the reasons why we thought this book was relevant, because it wasn't just a time capsule, it was also a way of reflecting on today's Washington, to your point. The Jack Danforth and Jim Bakers of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, would find a very different atmosphere in Washington today, one that's not as conducive to the kind of deal making and compromise that was once the coin of the realm. Baker understood that he was out to get, Baker wanted to get his priorities. It wasn't that he didn't care about his issues, but he also recognized that in the 12 years he worked for Reagan and Bush 41, they had a Democratic House the entire time. And the idea of just simply tilting against windmills in order to have an issue for the next election wasn't very appealing. There was this incentive structure, which has changed today, in which compromise was rewarded. Again, you were a great practitioner of that and an exemplar of that. So is Secretary Baker.
I thought, just out of my Walter Mitty life, that if I had been Biden when he came in, I sort of thought Biden was a deal maker, and that was what he would do in the White House. And I kind of thought, had I been in his position, I would have gotten somebody like a Jim Baker and maybe Leon Panetta or Tom Daschle or somebody, and just said, look, here's what I would like to accomplish as president. These are the general guidelines. Go out and do it for me. But in fact, it was just the opposite of that. And so now we have this $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation process. And I'm wondering what Baker would have thought about that. I mean, maybe he would have thought, well, anything that works is good. On the other hand, he may have thought that this my way or the highway approach and just one party approach was absolutely opposite of the Jim Baker method.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that he would have, but what is it? Jim Baker, if he were a young man today and coming to Washington, of course he wouldn't be the Jim Baker of 1976, because the world has changed and the politics have changed. And I would say that he's wired for success, and he's somebody who is wired to understand what power is and how to calibrate it. And so he probably would make an entirely different set of calculations, to be honest, in today's Washington than he would have. So part of the challenge, right, is that it's not just an exercise in time travel to write a biography, but to understand how rooted in the moment anyone's story is, right? And that, perhaps he had the same native gifts of, intelligence and whatever he brought to Washington from his background in Texas and as a corporate lawyer. But the circumstances of politics are so fundamentally different. I think that's why our book is a work of history, because we can't just say, well, here, this worked in 1986 with the tax reform, and so therefore we should try it again today. The Republican Party, which you served, which Jim Baker served, is a different Republican Party today. And, although there were elements of the cult of personality around Ronald Reagan, better than I, it wasn't like what we've seen the last few years. And so it's just a fundamentally, not only is it a different time, in some ways, it's almost an unrecognizable time.
I mean, one of the things in a quote from your book is, he was no visionary. He articulated no grand plan. He could bring together people who were more comfortable apart and find pragmatic ways to paper over rifts. Do you think that there's almost an inverse relationship between having very strong ideological positions and being able to be a deal maker?
Well, that's a good question. Obviously, they do tend to tug at each other, right? I mean, the stronger your ideological viewpoint, left or right, is, the more reluctant you are perhaps to make the compromises necessary to get someplace. You really want to take half a loaf. And a lot of people in Washington these days don't want to. I don't think it's necessarily is mutually exclusive. I mean, Reagan, for whom, Jim Baker worked for 8 years, was the one who told him, look, I'd rather get 80% of what I want than fly my flag going over the cliff and get nothing. And I think that people misunderstood that Reagan, while being very strong in his, conservative outlook on things, was also a pragmatist at times as well. Why else would he have Jim Baker as his chief of staff in the first place? Jim Baker had run not one, but two campaigns against Ronald Reagan in 1976 and 1980. And yet Reagan was enough of a pragmatist to say, well, let's get the guy who I think can actually get some stuff done. So I think that it's not necessarily mutually exclusive, but you're right that it tends to tug, they tug apart, between strong ideology and the inclination for compromise.
Maybe it helps not to be in elective politics yourself. I don't know. I mean, Jim Baker only ran once for elective office. That was for Attorney General of Texas, a campaign to which I contributed some money, and I took every opportunity to remind Jim of that little fact. But maybe on the other hand, there are people who were great deal makers back in my day who were in elective politics. Bob Dole would be an example. Russell Long would be an example. I mean, these people knew how to get things done, and they, very much like Baker, were results oriented, but they did certainly have their points of view. But I'm just wondering if today, being an elective office where you have to appeal to the base and you have to almost you're going to be primaried if you're not pure enough, if it wouldn't be helpful today for elected presidents to pick somebody like a Baker, like a Panetta, to come in and try to work things out for you.
That is I think it's such an important insight. For Jim Baker, that was the one big failure, in his career in politics, was to actually be the guy whose name was on the ballot himself in 1978. It's a great example, by the way, of that kind of Silicon Valley cliche that, failure is the most important prerequisite to success, right? Had Jim Baker not lost that campaign in 1978, he never would have been White House chief of staff. He never would have been probably Secretary of State. So for him, losing was actually a really good deal. But it also, I think you're right that it revealed something fundamental about his personality and who he was. He just wasn't a baby kisser. He didn't feel comfortable doing it. We, had this great interview with a guy from the Houston Chronicle who covered the campaign, and they would fly around, Texas, such a huge state, in a small jet, and they get to the county fair, and Jim Baker would make a beeline to the tent where all the politicians were congregating to find out what was really going on behind the scenes in the county, but he wouldn't stop and ask anybody for their vote. And so he wasn't wired to do that. But also, I think you're right that there was something too about the nature of it's really hard to make deals of the kind that we're talking about, and the kind of deals that Jim Baker made, they're really hard to pull off. And if you're constantly thinking about, what's going to be the chyron on cable news, in 10-minute increments, as you're actually trying to wheel and deal your way into a deal that nobody thinks is going to happen, you're probably not going to make the deal, right? So it was probably not only his personal good fortune to lose that race, but it probably was in service of deals he might not have ever made.
You have so many good examples of how Jim Baker operated. And just picking one of them out that you might describe, the taking Nicaragua off the table as a domestic political controversy, and how he went about doing that. It really is a fascinating story of somebody who could listen to both sides and somehow figure out how to get something accomplished. So you might just describe that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. That's an example I really like myself, because it's sort of overlooked. A lot of people don't really remember what happened, but you're right. The Contras and the war in Nicaragua had consumed Washington for a decade, divided Democrats from Republicans, almost brought down Reagan in the Iran-Contra scandal. And Baker was going in as Secretary of State for President-elect George H.W. Bush. He didn't want that on the table. He says, well, let's not have another term, distracted by this intractable problem. So what he does was he goes and sits down to dinner at Bob Strauss's apartment. Bob Strauss was the former Democratic chairman, with Jim Wright, the Democratic Speaker of the House, and they say, let's have a deal, okay? Let's have we'll have a little bit of money from Congress. You guys will agree to give some money to keep the Contras alive, not to fight, but to keep them alive for a year, and then we'll have an election, and we'll agree, we the Republicans, to whoever wins. If the Sandinistas win, fine. As long as it's a free and fair election, we will agree to that. That was a big thing, because they actually thought the Sandinistas would win. In the end, they didn't. But it was Jimmy Carter, again, a Democrat on the ground, who helped Jim Baker make sure that election was free and fair, and make sure that the Sandinistas did give up when they lost. And I think you're right, because it's so important to say, because he wanted to get past the ideology. He wanted to get past the soft on communism, tough on communism paradigm, and say, let's just make this go away so we can get some stuff done.
You tell the story of President Carter, and he's in Managua, and he has a team of people who are monitoring the election between Daniel Ortega and Violeta Chamorro. Mm-hmm. And I was part of that team. And so one little fact that you include in your book, which it's amazing to me that you found it, because it just seemed to me to be so obscure, but also so illustrative of the kind of person Baker was, and Carter for that matter. So the election is over, and it's very, very late, I guess early in the morning. And I've been out in the countryside doing election monitoring, and I came into the hotel, and I go to the hospitality, it's called the hospitality room, to get something to drink before going to bed. And Carter is in the room with, I can't remember the name of his associate, but Carter's in the room, and he's on the phone with Jim Baker. Now, Baker has run 2 campaigns against Carter, right?
Right, yes.
So he's on the phone with Carter, and Carter is saying, now, Jim, here's exactly what I think you should say. Here's what I think you should say about this. So then I went to bed and woke up the next morning and turned on CNN, and here was Baker saying exactly what Carter told them to say.
Yeah.
It was so interesting that here are these people who were totally opposed, affecting the future, the career of Jimmy Carter, and this was the exchange between them.
That is such a great story, especially because I was going to point out to people what they might not realize, which is also the incredible timing of this deal, to take the domestic American politics, US politics out of this very supercharged Central America issue. This happened in the immediate aftermath of the 1988 presidential election, which Jim Baker had run for George H.W. Bush, and which was, just a brutal and nasty campaign. It was as partisan as they come. A lot of people see in the 1988 campaign almost a precursor, of some of today's real scorched earth politics. Baker had not, the campaign had not directly run the Willie Horton ad, but that was part of the whole context and backdrop. The campaign had used the Willie Horton issue. They had, basically scorched turned Michael Dukakis, a more or less technocratic governor of Massachusetts, into, some sort of raving, insane liberal who was going to destroy American democracy. And yet, literally, not even 2 weeks later, I think, is when this dinner occurred between the Democratic Speaker of the House and Jim Baker to talk about how could we make a bipartisan agreement to get this off the table. And to me, if you want to ask what's the biggest single kind of difference between today's politics and then, I think that's probably the best illustration in the book.
I suppose Baker could be criticized. I don't know. Maybe I don't know how you end up. I think you end up admiring him a lot because he is somebody who could do this kind of thing and bring people together and figure it out, really, just figure out how to bridge these differences. On the other hand, he was not an ideologically driven person. He just didn't have these strong convictions. How do you balance in your own assessment of Baker the two? Do you think that, okay, sort of anything for a deal, or was he quite that? Maybe he wasn't quite that far in his deal making, anything for a deal, but pretty close to it, right? He just wanted to come to the finish line.
He did believe in deals, and I think that I think he was a legitimate conservative, but he wouldn't count as a conservative in today's context, right? Today's context, as you said, is about purity. He wasn't about purity. In any negotiation, he was going to argue the conservative side of things. He just wasn't going to fall on a sword for it. He just wasn't going to waste time on things that weren't going to go anywhere. So when he's chief of staff to Reagan, who was promised to get rid of the education department and get rid of the energy department, Baker says, I'm not going to waste any time on that because there is exactly zero chance of that happening. Whether he agreed with it or not was irrelevant. It was not going to happen. And he just is a very cold-eyed evaluator of what is possible and what is not. And, and he has continued to do that even after leaving office. Susan and I like to tell the stories. Even after leaving office, he's brokered compromises on things like the Episcopal Church's fight over same-sex marriage in Texas, over the Eisenhower Memorial opening in Washington, D.C. He was on a war powers commission, co-chair with Warren Christopher, against whom he had gone up in the Florida recount. So he doesn't hold on to old grudges. He doesn't hold on to partisan feelings outside of the campaign context because he wants to get stuff done.
Yeah, and you say this in the book clearly about, when you talk about Baker considered running for president in 1996, and he decided not to do it. And I guess the main reason is, why end up being a loser when you've been a winner for decades? But you also say that he was a product of a different fading time. The party was moving on, the Republican Party. Baker found his style of republicanism on the wane. And if you could, you've already talked about it, but just elaborate on a little bit about it, because I spent a lot of my life in the Republican Party also. And what's happened to it?
Well, I think that era, that particular moment, 1996, when he was thinking about running for president, was the very moment that Newt Gingrich was on the rise, right? He had just won the House in 1994, and his style of combative, wedge issue politics was anathema to Baker. I mean, Baker was certainly during a campaign cycle willing to play that, as Susan mentioned about 1988. But when the election was over, he really did believe about getting stuff done, and that wasn't really Gingrich's style. Gingrich was, he was an exploder of institutions and an exploder of norms in some ways. Maybe a precursor to Donald Trump years later. And that wasn't Baker's style. He was an institution believer and an institution builder. And so we interviewed him once and we asked him, so why didn't you run in 1996? And he goes, well, I was tired. I'd been at the height of government for all these years and I was exhausted. And thank goodness his wife was there, Susan Baker, who was wonderful. And she says, oh, honey, she says, the party, you were seen as too liberal. The party had begun to move on. Now, Baker wasn't a liberal, but in that context, what she was saying was the Gingrich Republicans didn't see Baker as one of them. And while Bob Dole, as you mentioned, obviously a famed deal maker himself, did win the nomination in 1996, he never had the support of that part of the Republican Party that had the energy at that moment.
I don't want to leave the impression that he was just a good deal maker, which he was, and that's so important in Washington. But he's also just a really good guy.
Yeah.
And I don't know at age 90 if he's still an elk hunter. But I know I was in Houston when he was well into his 80s, and I had lunch with Susan, but Jim wasn't there because he was out in Wyoming hunting elk. Well, elk hunting is not for the physically frail.
That's right.
It's climbing up mountains and high altitudes looking for elk, and that's where he was. He's really, and he's got a good sense of humor. He's a very entertaining person to be around, but he could get things done. It was just terrific. Yeah. Just as a summary question, what do you think Americans in the year 2021 can or should learn from the story of Jim Baker?
Well, first, let me just say, this has been a great conversation, and I love that you brought it around to Jim Baker, the person. That was also our experience. And by the way, hunting is truly one of his great loves. He's really as much a man of the West as he is a man, of Texas. And he and his wife, Susan, actually got COVID at the beginning of the pandemic. And, they were at that time 90 years old, he was. And he said, it really knocked him out for about, 10 days. And you know what the first thing he did was when he got better? 2 weeks later, he went back out and he went hunting again in Wyoming. So, this is something that I think, really was his own, what he's wired to do. And we should all be as strong as he is well into his ninth decade, I would say.
It really is just an excellent book. It's so well done. It's such an important subject, I think, not just as a study of a person who was very significant historically, but as a model of what politics is when it works. And to take that lesson into the 2020s, it's an important thing to do. I don't think we're very successful in doing that yet, but maybe so, I don't know. But just wonderful to be with you, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Delight
so
to be
much.
with you.